Arizona Territory, 1879. The sun had barely crested the ridgeline when Zeke Whitlow stepped through the swinging doors of the brothel, dropped a pouch heavy with silver on the table, and said, "I'm buying her out." No more doors locked behind her. The madam blinked, then narrowed her eyes. "Which one?" Zeke tilted his hat back and looked toward the dim hallway where the women waited. "The one with the braid down to her waist. The one they keep closest to the stairs. Zadie Monroe." Zadie had been sold into this place 2 years back by a man she once called husband, left with nothing but bruises, an old locket, and a fierce will to survive. She never smiled, never cried where anyone could see, and never let any man touch her without permission, which meant nearly none of them did. Zeke had seen her only twice before. Once when he'd come to settle his tab with the barkeep. The second time, when he'd stepped between her and a drunk with a knife, said nothing, and left the man bleeding from the nose and crawling out the door. Since then, he couldn't stop thinking about her, how her eyes had met his, proud and hollow, like a woman who had not been offered kindness in a long, long time. The madam scoffed. "You think she's worth that much?" "I know it," Zeke said, "and I ain't asking." She took the pouch, opened it, and her eyes widened. "This buys her name off the books. She walks out clean." Zeke nodded. "Then send her out." Zadie came down the hall barefoot, the hem of her dress dragging. She stopped when she saw him, her arms crossing tight over her chest. "You bought me?" "No," Zeke said, voice low. "I bought your freedom." She studied him like a coyote might study an open hand. "What do you want in return?" Zeke tipped his hat back on his head. "Nothing you do not offer first." She blinked. That made no sense to her world. Her world had always taken. "I have a cabin," he added. "Few hours out. You can stay if you want. Or I can ride you to the next town. But you do not owe me anything." Zadie looked past him to the open door, to the street where dust danced in the rising light. Then she looked back at the hallway behind her. She took a breath, then stepped outside. They rode in silence most of the morning. Zadie's hands were clenched on the horn of the saddle, her eyes darting at every sound, each snapping branch, every cry of a hawk. Zeke kept his distance. He rode ahead, never looking back unless she stopped. By midday, they reached his land. It was dry, but not dead. A small creek ran behind the cabin, and a garden patch sat waiting for spring. The house was one room, simple but clean. A cot in the corner, a stove in the center, and a rocker on the porch that faced the hills. Zadie stood on the porch and said nothing. "You take the bed," Zeke said, hanging his hat on the nail by the door. "I'll sleep outside, or on the floor." She glanced at him, uncertain. "You live out here alone?" "Been that way a while." Zadie looked around. "You built this?" "Every plank." She stepped inside, ran her fingertips along the windowsill. "No one ever gave me a room without a price." Zeke leaned against the doorframe. "Then maybe it is time someone did." That night, she sat by the fire and stared into the flames. Zeke took a blanket and lay down by the far wall. He said nothing more. She did not ask questions. The days passed slow, but not unkind. Zadie helped with the chores, gathering eggs, hauling water, sweeping the porch. She said little, but her shoulders started to drop from where they had always been tight. She began to hum sometimes when she cooked. Zeke never interrupted it. He never touched her. Not once. He never entered the room without knocking, never crossed her path when she was changing, never let his eyes linger too long. And every day, he left a fresh cup of coffee on the porch rail for her before heading out to the pasture. One morning, a week after she arrived, Zadie came out to find him mending a fence post. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his hands blistered. He worked without complaint, jaw set, eyes fixed on the task. She stepped up quietly and handed him a clean rag. He blinked, surprised, but took it. "Thank you." You should wear gloves, she said. I break and faster than they help. Zadie gave a small huff of a laugh. It was the first time he heard it. He didn't say anything, but something in his chest twisted warm. That night, she sat beside him on the porch for the first time. The stars were out, and the wind was soft. Zadie pulled her knees up and hugged them. You ever been married?
No, she nodded.
Smart. Zeke glanced at her. You. Her mouth twisted. Wife at 16. Widow at 18. Sold to a brothel before the dirt even settled on his grave. Zeke set his jaw. You were not meant for that. She looked at him. You do not even know me. I do not need to know the past to see how strong someone is now. Zadie looked down, silent for a long moment. Then she asked, Why did you do it? Do what? Buy me out. You barely knew me. He turned to her, voice even. Because no one should live in a locked room. She swallowed hard. That night, she did not go to sleep right away. She stayed up, watching the fire burn low. Watching the man who had given her back her name, her breath, her space. She began to see him in a different way, not just strong, not just quiet, but kind. And kind had always been harder to find than anything else. The next morning, she reached for the coffee cup he left her and found a small bloom tucked beside it. A desert lily, white and delicate. She stared at it for a long time. Then she looked toward the pasture, where Zeke was already walking the fence line. She picked up the flower and held it close. He had not touched her. Not once. But something inside her had started to ache, not with fear, but with want. And for the first time in years, Zadie Monroe felt safe enough to want anything at all. A week after the flower, the rains came. Not heavy, just a steady hush that softened the dust and made the earth smell clean. Zadie stood at the doorway, watching the droplets gather along the eaves, her braid pulled over one shoulder. She didn't flinch when the thunder rolled. She didn't turn when Zeke came up beside her, just said, Does it flood here? Sometimes further down the wash, he said. We're higher than it. She nodded, her eyes on the land. It's quiet when it rains. Zeke leaned against the frame. You miss the noise? I miss knowing what came next. Her voice was steady, but low. Even when it was bad, I knew the shape of the day. Now it's just open. He thought on that a beat. Open can be a kind of peace. Or a kind of lost. She didn't say more, and he didn't press. The rain went on. That afternoon, she brought in the wash before he asked. Hung it inside the cabin from a line he kept strung across the rafters. She rolled his socks and folded the shirts with a care that surprised her. Her hands had always been used for defense or survival. Folding cloth felt almost like grace. Zeke came in later with mud on his boots and a gash across the back of his hand. She saw it before he could brush past her. What happened? She asked, already reaching for the basin. Wire slipped, he said. Caught me when the post leaned wrong. She poured water into the tin bowl and dipped a clean rag. Sit. He looked at her, then obeyed, slow, uncertain. She knelt in front of him, her fingers gentle but sure as she cleaned the wound. You didn't flinch, he said. I know what pain looks like when it's worth it. Zeke watched her as she worked. You ever patch up scrapes before? Plenty. My father broke horses. My brothers followed him into wild things. I was the one left with the salves. You ever think about going back to them? She wrung out the cloth, her jaw tight. They buried me when I married him. Said I chose wrong, so I lived with it. Zeke said nothing. She bound the wound with strips of linen, then sat back on her heels. Thank you, he said. She nodded, not looking up. You should eat something. That night, he found his plate already set on the table. A stew that didn't taste like his usual fare. When she sat across from him, she didn't eat right away. She just watched, quiet, waiting. He took a bite, then another. You use sage. From the back hill. It grows near the stones.
He gave a nod, slow.
It's good. Zadie didn't smile. But she didn't look away either. The rain lasted through morning. The air turned cooler, and the creek ran faster. Zadie took to walking the edge of it just after chores, boots trailing through the wet grass. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. One morning, she found Zeke sitting on the bank with his boots off, trousers rolled to his knees. He was carving something small in his hand with a pocket knife. She hesitated, then stepped closer. Whittling, he held it up. A small horse, rough, but shaped true. Trying. She crouched beside him, brushing her fingers over the carved mane. You ever sell them?
No.
Just pass the time. Zadie looked at the line of them on the porch rail later. There were 5. All animals, none perfect, but all made with care. That evening, she placed a 6th beside them. A bird she'd carve herself with the same knife. She didn't say a word about it. Neither did he. But the next morning, it was smoothed with oil and sitting in the center of the row. The days grew longer. The earth began to warm again. Zadie planted beans along the edge of the garden, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, fingers digging in without fear. She didn't ask Zeke where to place them. She just did it, like someone who'd finally decided to stay. One night, the fire burned low, and she didn't rise to go to bed. She leaned back in the rocker, her braid undone and falling over one shoulder. You ever think about what comes next? She asked, not looking at him. Zeke stirred the coals with a poker. Sometimes. What do you see? He set the poker down. A roof that holds through winter. A field that grows enough to trade. Maybe someone to share the work. She turned her head slightly, watching him. He added, but only if she wants it. Zadie's voice was quiet. And if she's not sure yet, then I wait.
She rose then.
Crossed the room. Stopped just in front of him, her bare feet silent on the floorboards. Her hand reached out, slow and uncertain, and touched the edge of his shirt. Zeke didn't move. Her fingers slid up to his collar, resting there like a question. He looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw no hunger, no claim, only the steadiness of someone who would not move unless asked to. Her breath caught. Then she leaned down and pressed her forehead to his shoulder. Zeke lifted one hand and rested it on her back, gentle and sure.
She didn't speak.
Neither did he. But she stayed there a long time. And when she finally pulled away, her face was softer. Her eyes clear. She reached for his hand before walking to the bed. He followed. Spring stretched its legs slow and steady across the Arizona earth. The garden rose greened in fits, beans curling upward with the stubborn will of things that wanted to live. Zadie moved among them barefoot in the early light, her skirt hem damp with dew, fingers trailing the leaves like she was learning them by touch. The days had settled into a rhythm neither of them spoke aloud. She took to making bread in the mornings, shaping it without thought, the muscle memory of her mother's kitchen rising in her hands. Zeke worked the pasture fence, walking with a limp that hadn't been there before, though he said nothing about it. One afternoon she waited until he came in and dropped his tools by the door. Your leg, she said, not asking. He sat slow on the edge of the bed. Horse stepped wrong in a gopher hole last week. Been favoring it since. Zadie crossed to the stove, poured water into a kettle. You should rest it. Can't mend a fence from a chair. She turned, folding her arms. You got someone to impress out there? Zeke looked up, eyes steady. Just want to keep the place standing. Steam rose behind her as the kettle began to hum. She nodded once, then reached for the willow bark she'd tucked in a tin beside the matches. You'll drink this before you go out again, she said. Boiled long enough it won't taste like shoe leather. He took the cup when she handed it over, his fingers brushing hers for the first time since she'd pulled him to bed that night. She didn't flinch. Neither did he. Later, when the sun was high, She found him seated beneath the cottonwood near the creek, legs stretched out, a rifle laid across his lap. He didn't startle when she approached. "You're watching for coyotes?" she asked. "Couple jackrabbits came too near the hens. Want to keep them wary." She sat down beside him, folding her hands in her lap. "My father used to say, a hungry animal's the only honest kind." Zeke nodded, eyes on the tree line. "Most men are the opposite."
Zadie studied him then.
The way he sat quiet without needing to fill the air. How he didn't turn when he spoke, just let the words find their own way out. "You ever want a family?" she asked. He shifted slightly, but didn't look at her. "Used to think about it. Before the war." She waited. "Afterward, I kept too much of it with me. Didn't think I'd be fit for raising anything but fence posts." Zadie reached down, pulled a blade of grass from the earth, twisted it between her fingers. "You ain't as broken as you think." He gave a quiet hum at that, but didn't argue. The wind carried the scent of dry sage and warming soil. She leaned back on her palms, gaze up toward the open sky. "I never thought I'd end up here," she said. "Not in this place. Not with someone who didn't want to own me." Zeke's voice was low. "That was never mine to want."
She looked at him then.
"It's mine now." He didn't answer. Just met her eyes, and in the stillness between them, something shifted. That night, she didn't wait for the fire to burn down. She stepped behind him while he sat at the table, her hands resting on his shoulders. He stilled, not from fear, but from reverence. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect? Someone who wanted to rescue me just to name the shape I'd take next?" Zeke turned his head slightly, enough to see her out the corner of his eye. "I only wanted to give you something steady to stand on." Her hands slid down his arms, slow and certain. "You did." She led him to the bed this time, her fingers unfastening the buttons of his shirt with quiet purpose. He didn't rush her, didn't reach until she pulled his hand to her waist. In the hush between oil lamp and night wind, they undressed one another like it was prayer.
"No hast, no hunger."
Just the slow recognition of skin that had never been touched without cost. Zadie rested her head against his chest when it was done, the soft rise and fall beneath her ear the only sound between them. His arm came around her back, the weight of it neither pressing nor light, just there, like it had always belonged. In the days that followed, nothing outward changed. The chores remained, the hens still needed feeding, and the fence mending never seemed to end. But she moved through the cabin like it was hers now, reaching over him to stir the pot, taking his tools without asking, laughing once, full and sharp, when he dropped a pail of water on his boot. He looked at her then like he was seeing the full sun through fog for the first time. One morning, she came in from the garden with dirt on her cheek and a bundle of greens in her arms. She set them down, wiped her hands, and said, "I've been thinking." Zeke looked up from the table, where he was shaping a new handle for the hatchet. "About. There's a girl in town.
Clara May.
Can't be more than 12. She's got no schooling, and her ma's too sick to teach her letters." Zeke waited. "I was taught. Proper. Back before everything. I could teach her. Maybe others too. You want to ride in each day? I want to bring them here. Once a week. Just a few. They'd be safe." He leaned back in his chair, considering. "You'd make a good teacher." "I'd make use of what I still have," she said. "And they'd see a woman who came through something and still stood." Zeke nodded, slow. "Then we'll clear the front room. Make space." Her eyes shone, not with tears, but something steadier.
Pride, maybe.
Or the first light of purpose. She crossed the room, touched his face with the back of her hand. "You always let me choose," she said. "You never needed permission." Zadie leaned in and kissed him soft, sure. Not like a woman reaching for safety, but like one claiming what she'd built. Outside, the wind carried the scent of mesquite and new blossoms. Inside, Their world kept turning quiet, whole, and entirely their own. By late April, the first of the children began to arrive. They came on foot or by mule cart, some holding slates, others with nothing but hand-me-down clothes and wide, uncertain eyes. Zadie met them at the edge of the porch in a dress she'd sewn from flour sacks, her hair pinned up, jaw set with quiet purpose. She led them inside without fuss, cleared space near the window where the light came strongest, and laid out lessons in chalk and patience. Zeke kept to the pasture those days, giving them the room. He never asked how many came or what she taught. But he mended the benches sturdier and built a small shelf for the books she'd found in town, and when he passed by the open window, he slowed his step just enough to hear her voice. One of the boys, thin, sharp-eyed, maybe 9, started showing up early. He waited outside until Zadie opened the door, then sat by the hearth drawing maps with a stub of charcoal. One morning, she crouched beside him. "You know what you're drawing? It's where my uncle traps. He says the river bends twice, but I only seen it once." Zadie looked at the lines. "Then you're remembering from sound and not sight." He shrugged. "I guess. That's good. Means you're building pictures in your head." He glanced up. "Is that what you do?" She didn't answer right away. "I used to forget what the sky looked like. So, I kept it in my mind until I could see it again." He blinked once, then went back to the charcoal. That evening, after the children had gone and the house was quiet again, Zadie folded the cloth over the last of the biscuits and turned to where Zeke sat on the porch mending a bridle strap. "You ever think about what it'd be like to raise someone?" Zeke didn't lift his eyes, just kept threading the rawhide through the buckle. "Didn't think I'd be the type." "That's not what I ask." He paused then. "I'd do it careful, not soft, but steady. Like building a fence post that won't lean come winter." She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You think that's what a child needs most?" "Not everything, but it's the part one know how to give." She stepped down and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "I'd want them to know they're not born to be owned." Zeke nodded. "Then we'd raise them right." Neither spoke for a while. The stars came out slow, one by one. A week later, she returned from town with a wrapped parcel under one arm and dust on her boots. Zeke looked up from the barn door as she dismounted. "Trouble?"
None.
"But I had a thought," she said, handing the package to him. "Open it." He untied the string and peeled back the paper. Inside was a ledger book, stitched leather, blank pages. "You keeping accounts now?" he asked. "For the children. Records of what they learn. If they ever leave here, I want them to carry proof of what they know." Zeke flipped the cover open, thumbed the first page. "You always this forward-thinking?" "I'm done waiting for someone else to give me permission." He looked at her then, long and quiet. "You're not like anyone I've known."
"I hope not," she said.
They never lasted. She took the book from his hands, slid it into the crook of her arm, and walked inside. Later that night, she pulled a rocker close to the stove and dipped her pen in ink. Zeke watched her from the bed, his shirt unbuttoned, one leg stretched out from where the limp still lingered. She didn't look up from the page. "You ever learn your letters?"
"Some."
"Enough to read feed prices and land deeds." She set the pen down and turned in her chair. "Come here." He rose, walked over barefoot, and stood beside her. She pointed to a word at the top of the page. "Spell that." He narrowed his eyes. "Hope." She nodded. "That's what I mean to give them." Zeke rested his hand on the back of her chair, fingers brushing wood. "What do you mean to give me?" he asked. Zadie looked up, met his gaze, without blinking. Room to be more than what the world already decided. He bent then, slow enough she could stop him if she wished, but she didn't. Their foreheads touched, breath mingling in the space between. "You think there's room for both of us in that?" he asked. "We've already built it." He kissed her then slow, sure, and without question. When they parted, She trailed her fingers down his jaw, then rose from the chair and took his hand. In the quiet warmth of the cabin, they moved together once more, not like people healing, but like people who had healed and now meant to live. The next morning, Zeke woke to find her still beside him, one leg tangled with his, her cheek against his shoulder. He didn't move, just let the light rise and the day wait. Out beyond the porch, the garden had started to bloom. By early June, the hills above the creek turned the color of brass, and the heat came down in waves that shimmered along the fence lines. Zadie started waking just before first light to beat the worst of it, pulling water from the spring and laying damp cloths across the window panes to keep the small classroom bearable for the children. One of the girls, Mary Ellen, with hair the shade of wheat, had begun bringing her younger brother along, a boy not more than 5, who sat cross-legged by the door chewing the ends of pencils and humming tunelessly. Zadie didn't turn him away. Zeke had taken to rising before her now, some private rhythm shifting in him since the children began arriving regular. He'd never say it, but she noticed the way he trimmed the path to the porch, or how he sanded the splinters from the benches without being asked. He never lingered near the window where she taught, but she felt him watching sometimes from the shade of the barn just long enough to know he was listening. One late afternoon, after the last child had gone and the sun had dropped enough to ease the heat, she found him sitting on the stoop, a folded paper in one hand. "You been to town?" she asked, wiping her palms on her apron. He held out the paper. Telegraph came. She took it. The address at the top was from Bisbee, the script tightly written but familiar. "My brother," she said, reading low, "says he's clearing his father-in-law's land near the border. Wants to know if I'm alive." Zeke didn't speak right away. "I hadn't thought about writing him," she said. "Didn't think he'd care to hear. Do you want to?" She folded the paper in half, then again. "I think I want him to know I didn't vanish." Zeke nodded. "Then I'll write it to the post in the morning." She looked at him then, his face lined from the sun, the crease between his brows deeper than it had been in March. "You'd do that?" He met her eyes. "If you've got something to say, it ought to get there." She stepped down beside him, the folded paper still in her hand. "I used to think I didn't belong anywhere. Now I'm not sure how I ever belonged anywhere else." He touched her wrist, calloused fingers warm against her skin. "You made this place real, Zadie. I just built the walls." She leaned into him, her shoulder against his. "I want to stay. And I want to be more than just the woman who teaches once a week." Zeke turned toward her. "You already are." She lifted her chin, eyes searching his. "Then let's make it plain." He didn't ask what she meant. He just stood, took her hand, and led her inside. They stood by the hearth where the stone was warm from the day's heat. She removed her apron. He brushed his fingers along the line of her jaw. "I've never asked proper," he said. "But I would want you beside me for good. Not just in this house, but in name. In everything." She nodded, her voice steady. "Then ask." He took her hands in both of his. "Zadie Monroe, would you marry me?" "Yes," she said without pause. "I will." They wed in the shade of the cottonwood, with only the children, Mary Ellen's mother, and the town's circuit preacher bearing witness. Zadie wore a pale blue dress borrowed from a neighbor, and Zeke wore his best shirt, sleeves rolled and collar pressed flat. There was no ring, they couldn't afford one yet, but he carved a band from juniper, smooth and light, and slipped it over her finger with hands that never once trembled. The children clapped. Mary Ellen brought a small cake wrapped in cheesecloth. They shared it with tin cups of sweet tea, and Zeke kissed her once, soft and unhurried, in front of everyone. They spent their wedding night in the cabin, the windows open, the air scented with creosote from the hills. Zadie pulled her braid loose and lay beside him, her hand resting over his chest. "You know what I'd like?" she asked. He turned to her, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "I'd like to build something they can come back to." Not just the children, but the ones they'll raise too. A place that doesn't forget them when they grow. Zeke nodded, voice low. Then we'll build it. And they did. By the next spring, the garden stretched twice as wide. The children came more than once a week, and Zadie taught them numbers and stories and how to write their names so fine they could sign them with pride. Zeke built a second room onto the cabin with timber brought down from the ridge. He taught one of the older boys how to measure cuts and drive nails without splitting grain. When storms came, neighbors sheltered under their roof. When food ran short, no one left hungry. They never spoke much of what came before, not because they were avoiding it, but because they no longer had to. The past had settled behind them, not forgotten, but no longer sharp. In the evenings, after the children had gone and the sky turned gold, Zadie would sit beside him on the porch, her hand resting against his knee, her head leaned against his shoulder. They didn't speak unless there was something worth saying. Most nights, the quiet was enough. And when the first baby came, a girl with her mother's steady gaze and her father's calm, Zeke built a cradle by hand, and Zadie sang to her with a voice no one had heard before, soft and low, and full of the kind of love that doesn't ask to be earned. They named her Ruth, after Zeke's mother, and raised her with the same care they gave their land, a life grown with patience, shaped by hands that had once known hunger but now knew only peace. And through each season, they stayed together, whole and home.